Got time? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Christian Wade. Welcome to this session. I hope you're enjoying San Diego. Are you catching any waves later? No? All right. Sorry? Waves of heat. There you go. Yeah, I've been living in the Californian Central Valley for the last 6 years, so I feel you. Anyway, so I'm Christian Wade. I'm an independent consultant based in California. I have a little bit of an accent. I hope you can understand most of what I say. Just let me know if you want me to speak slowly. I'm just kidding. So I've been working as an independent consultant for an oil company for the last 6 years in the Californian Central Valley, actually working out of an oil field for the first 3 years in a trailer. And I quite like that kind of lifestyle. It's a different lifestyle to what I used to have. And no, seriously, I love America, and just glad to be here in San Diego. I'm going to catch some waves later on, so I'm looking forward to it. Anyway, we're here to talk about Analysis Services 2012, not about me. The agenda is, I've got it split into 2 sessions, right? Part 1 and 2. And part 2 is going to be very technical, in-depth demos, right? Part 1 is going to cover what Microsoft is trying to achieve with this release in terms of the design goals and the features, and comparing the features between the 2, let's say, sub-products of multidimensional and tabular. All right, so we're going to go through a history of analysis services briefly, just to gauge how major a release this is. Is this just an evolutionary release, or is it really the next generation of the product? We'll then discuss the UDM versus the BISM, and multidimensional versus tabular. And then for the main event, we'll have MDX versus DAX. Okay. So just to cover a couple of prerequisites, maybe many of you may already know this, but when you install Analysis Services as part of the SQL Server 2012 install, you now have to specify whether you want it to run in multidimensional or tabular mode. Okay. Multidimensional is basically the same product that we've had since Analysis Services 2005. It's been enhanced, obviously, during that time, but it's basically the same product. I think it's fair to say that tabular is the next generation of analysis services. Hence, there is no migration path to get from, if you've got an existing 2008 R2 cube, and you want to go from there to 2012 multidimensional, that's fine. The upgrade is pretty seamless. If you want to go to tabular from there is no migration path. You have to rewrite the thing from scratch if you decide that it's worth doing that. Okay? And similarly, you can't go from tabular to multidimensional either. So it's quite important that if you're starting out a new project, that you understand the capabilities of the 2 kind of sub-products in order to make the right decision, because once you start down that road, you can't change your mind. Okay? All right. So back in late 1998, Microsoft released SQL Server 7, and that included a kind of sub-product called OLAP Services, which was the result of an acquisition of that product from an Israeli company called Panorama. And MDX was supported in this release. Back then, we didn't even have Management Studio, right? We had Query Analyzer. I don't know if anyone remembers Query Analyzer. That certainly didn't support MDX, right? So what we used to use for authoring MDX queries back then, I'm sure many of you remember it well. I'm just kidding. Was this MDX sample application, which was a VB6 app that would ship with SQL Server 7 and OLAP services, and it wasn't exactly the Ferrari of query authoring tools, but it was better than nothing, right? So just barely a year and a half later, SQL Server 2000 came out with Analysis Services 2000, and this really was just an evolution of the existing product, right? It wasn't really the next generation of the product. They did introduce data mining at that point. That's when we first got data mining. All right, fast forward to 2005. They took their time on this one. So 2005 really felt like a completely new product. It really felt like they'd rewritten the thing from the ground up, right? If you were programming to create and manage cubes, for example, to manage partitions and things like that, you had a completely new API to do that. It was called Analysis Management Objects, right? It was now hosted in Visual Studio. It just felt like a very different product. I don't know whether anyone here even remembers Analysis Services 2000, but any takers? No, well, I didn't think so. Anyway, the programming model for 2000 was decision support objects, a COM-based model, whereas the programming model for 2005 was analysis management objects, which we still have today. And it just felt like like it had been completely rewritten from the ground up, right? So from here on out in this presentation, I'm going to refer to all of this as just multidimensional, right? Which is the multidimensional subproduct. We also had a fluffy marketing term introduced with the 2005 release called the UDM. Does anyone know the UDM? Does anyone remember the UDM? Does anyone know what it stands for? Almost. The book is yours. Well done. I would come over and give it to you, but I'm plugged in here, and thank you, Peter. So that is the best book on the market for analysis services. You almost got it. Sorry. No, Unified Dimensional Model. Yeah, almost. Well done. Would you hold up the cover of that book? You know what? I've got a slide of it over here. So these are the two leading books on the market for Tabular, for Analysis Services Tabular, and this one covers it all. Chris Webb is, probably the leading guy in Analysis Services. Is probably had the leading blog for the past 3 or 4 years since Moshe Pazmansky. I don't know if anyone remembers Moshe Pazmansky, who was. I mentioned that when Microsoft bought OLAP services from Panorama, part of the deal was that they got a lot of the development team to go to Redmond, and the dev lead was Moshe Pazmansky, and he influenced the MDX language considerably. About 3 or 4 years ago, he just disappeared into thin air. You can probably Google him and find out, or Bing him and find out what happened to him. Anyway, so he's off in the cloud somewhere. And since then, Chris Webb has taken the charge, so to speak, and he's probably got the most authoritative blog on Analysis Services, MDX, and DAX. So anyway, and he's one of the authors over here. All right. Anyway, I digress. Sorry. So we got this fluffy marketing term called the UDM with the 2005 release, and the Unified Dimensional Model. Why was it unified, and why was it a little bit fluffy? Well, it was unified because, if you remember, it would bring together the best of both worlds. Pretty ambitious, right? It would bring together the best of existing OLAP reporting as we knew it in Analysis Services 2000, as well as all of the use cases that we would have normally had to resort to relational reporting, right? So, when using 2000, there was a bunch of cases where it just wouldn't support the requirement that you needed, even though it was a good tool at the time, but you would have often had to resort to relational reporting, just writing SQL against your data warehouse or whatever. So the reason it was unified was that it claimed to have one model to rule them all. You'd have just one model and it would support all of those requirements, right? So what were the kind of features that would enable it to do that? And we're 7 years after the initial release now, so I think it's a good kind of benchmark to look at those design goals that the UDM claimed, and we can judge how successful it was in meeting those design goals. So probably the biggest step forward from 2000 was the flexible relationships between entities. You know, it's an OLAP model or an OLAP databases, or even most, you know, you have to define your kind of aggregation paths or your relationships between your entities ahead of time, so that when you process it, everything's ready to roll. With 2000, it was very rigid. In 2005, we had all of these flexible relationships like many-to-many dimensions and role-playing dimensions and reference dimensions, and all of the modeling experience was far superior to 2000. Right, that was a big step forward and a big tick in the box for the release. The next one was the complex calculations through MDX scripting. Right, so this was the blessing and the curse. Right, it was highly sophisticated. I mean, the kinds of calculations you could do at the aggregated level would have been practically, some of those would have been practically impossible straight on your data warehouse, you know, using SQL. I mean, you could support really sophisticated calculations. You could use utility dimensions to organize your calculations for reusability. You felt really proud of your work. You know, you felt quite, the problem was no one knew what the heck it was doing, right? Because it was, you know, you'd write these 6,000 lines of MDX scripts, and it was good for your job retention, but it wasn't good for the proliferation of Microsoft BI because it was a little bit too difficult for people to understand and support. All right, so it was the blessing and the curse of the release. This was a UDM claim that I don't, 7 years later, I don't think it really lived up to, even today in 2012 multidimensional. So detail reporting means reporting that's closer to the transaction level, right? So you might be, for example, if you had a report with just all of the fact table rows, in a fact table, you might have thousands or millions of rows in the report. There's minimal aggregation or just low-level aggregation, very close to the transaction level. Whereas the traditional cube sweet spot is at the aggregated level, where there may have been 500 million transactions contributing to that single cell, but by definition, you're going to have a lot less rows and columns. That's the sweet spot of analysis services traditionally, right? So the UDM claimed to deliver detail reporting or closer to the transactional level, but the performance wasn't as good as we would like for that level. And you would have, in many cases, still resorted to relational reporting for this, right? This is probably the biggest case where you would still resort to relational reporting, even when using multidimensional today, is for the performance at the detail level. And then for completeness, I've put in real-time BI. I think it's fair to say this never really caught on. They put work into the release with that. They had proactive caching, which would supposedly give you near real-time BI for more operational type reports. But to be fair, I don't think it worked that well, and no one really used it. I think the vast majority of cubes out there today get refreshed overnight, and they're static during the day. Maybe you have a couple of measure groups refreshed during the day, but nothing more than that. Okay, so it never really penetrated this real-time BI market, and that's just my opinion. All right, so fast forward to today, and then now we've got this new generation of analysis services 2012 Tabular. I think it's fair to say it really is the next generation of analysis services, because the way that it stores the data, it compresses all the data into memory, which means that the queries are blazing fast, right? It's a form of column-oriented database that achieves very high compression ratios, which is why it manages to compress all that data into memory, like vast amounts of data, which is why when you submit the query, it doesn't even need to touch disk, right? So it just comes back really fast. And obviously the kind of hardware requirements are different, less focus on disk usage, more focused on RAM. But this is really the future of BI, I think, is in-memory analytics, and not just on the Microsoft platform, right? And we're really at the infancy of this next wave of BI. And a good article, if you want further information on that, is this from David Campbell, who's a technical fellow at Microsoft, and they don't hand out the technical fellow status, like it grows on trees. And he's talking about the coming in-memory database tipping point, that we're really at the eve of this next wave of in-memory analytics. And Microsoft's primary in-memory database offering is Analysis Services Tabular and Power Pivot, not multidimensional, right? So, as you know, just be aware of these things. Okay. So it's the next generation of the tool. It's the future of BI in general is in memory analytics, and so that alone justifies it as, in my opinion, the next generation of the product. It's not an evolutionary release. However, it does share a common lineage with multidimensional, and that's apparent in different ways. But one way that that's apparent is if you remember, I said that in 2000 the programming model was decision support objects. In 2005 we got a completely new programming model called analysis management objects. Well, funnily enough, we still use analysis management objects to create and manage tabular models with 2012 Tabular. And if you're ever using AMO to manage tabular models, it's pretty quickly apparent that if they'd rewritten this thing from the ground up completely, you'd be programming tables and columns and relationships instead of measure groups, dimensions, cubes, and hierarchies and things like that. Okay, so I'm not questioning Microsoft's decision to leverage their existing code base. I'm sure that it accelerated the release considerably, and it's inherited a bunch of features from multidimensional. For example, support for MDX queries. So I'm not questioning the decision. I'm just saying it's interesting to note that it does share a common lineage with multidimensional. It's kind of like multidimensional is this distant cousin, really, really distant, but does share some kind of common lineage. Because, yeah, and from that perspective, it's kind of interesting that the code base, which was first used for 2005, has gone through this mutation to being hosted in the Excel process as Power Pivot, and now it's emerged on the other side as this corporate BI offering in Analysis Services Tabular. So it's a bit of a mutant. And as I said, it's kind of an evolution of Power Pivot. Power Pivot, instead of being a distant cousin, is a close sibling, right? Power Pivot is Microsoft's self-service BI offering. We'll discuss self-service versus corporate BI shortly, but so in terms of it actually shares the same user interface. It's called the Tabular Model Designer. Whether it's hosted in Excel and you're interacting with it with the Office ribbon, or you're using, in Visual Studio using Properties window and Visual Studio toolbar, it's actually the same UI, which will, Microsoft may add features that appear in both products. So it's a very close kind of sibling to Analysis Services Tabular. And as I said, also Power Pivot supports the in-memory storage, which by the way is called X Velocity. That's what Microsoft's calling it, for branding purposes. It used to be called Vertipack. It's now called X Velocity. That's that whole thing where it compresses all the data into memory, right? Both of these use X Velocity. Multidimensional does not. All right. So you may ask the question. So we've got Power Pivot and Analysis Services Tabular, which both use X Velocity in memory storage. They're both blazing fast, support blazing fast queries, even for pretty large data sets. But they both share the same, Tabular Model Designer. So why do we need these two products? Well, obviously, I said we're going to discuss self-service versus corporate BI shortly, but in terms of the features, Analysis Services Tabular has support for things like perspectives. It has support for integration with source control because it's hosted in Visual Studio, right, which is huge. It has, dimension security, all of these enterprise type features. It neither has translations at this point, but I would expect that will come in a future release, and that would go into the Analysis Services Tabular, not Power Pivot. And then Analysis Services Tabular also has the scalability features, right? Because Power Pivot is just more geared to desktop users, so it's limited to 4 gigabytes memory usage, which you can fit a lot. Once it's compressed with X velocity, you can fit a lot of data into 4 gigabytes. But if you need your corporate BI offering with larger scale, you're going to need more memory than that. Like I said, the servers are going to be more focused on memory than disk usage. So you may typically have 30 to 50 gigabytes on a server for an analysis services tabular model, and there's no upper limit. The only limit is how much memory you can get on that box, right? So you've got the scalability features. You've got also partitioning is only supported in analysis services tabular, and interestingly, partitioning, unlike multidimensional, partitioning has no impact whatsoever on query performance, right? Because the queries submitted to the tabular model, it doesn't need to go and touch disk at all anyway. It's all in memory, so it's just going to give you the data straight back. It's not like optimized to only hit certain partitions on disk. However, you still use partitioning in analysis services tabular, but you use it just to improve tabular model processing times. Because obviously you need to query a lot less data from your data source or your data warehouse, and you need to refresh less data in the model in memory, so it's just quicker for tabular model processing times. Okay, so that tabular versus Power Pivot. As I say, we're going to discuss self-service versus corporate BI shortly. Another thing to point out is that the UDM that we discussed earlier has now been superseded by an even fluffier marketing term called the BI semantic model. They did a good job with that one, right? The reason it's fluffier is that it actually, if you remember, the UDM was one model to rule them all. Well, this is 3 models to rule them all. I don't know. Anyway, so you've got Power Pivot, Tabular, and Multidimensional are all part of the BI semantic model, right? So the UDM was useful just for evaluating how successful the product was in achieving its design goals. I'm not even going to go there with the BISM. So the key features of analysis services tabular are blazing fast performance, right? Like I said, all the data is in memory. It finally delivers the UDM claim of fast performance even at the detail level. Okay, you can write queries MDX or DAX against your tabular model, and the performance, even with thousands of rows, is going to be really, really fast in most cases. Quite often faster than relational reporting, even for thousands or millions of rows. All right. The other design goal is ease of implementation. So one of the criticisms that Microsoft received from multidimensional and MDX was that it was just too much of a learning curve. There's, BI traditionally being this niche market, and then you had this army of hardened DBAs who, been writing SQL since they were like 11, and then they need to suddenly make this leap to get to MDX, and MDX is out there on its own planet, and you can get there, but you might need one of those Virgin Galactic space shuttles to get there. It's the feedback they had was that it was too difficult to learn. It was too far out there in its own multidimensional world. So they tried to make analysis services tabular more tabular, surprisingly. It's more relational, right? You're not dealing with measure groups, and you'll see in the demos in part 2, but it's more like relational than multidimensional, and that means the ease of implementation is much better, or it achieves that design goal. Okay, and for completeness, I've put real-time BI. I think it's way too early to evaluate how successful tabular is going to be in penetrating that real-time BI market that the UDM was gunning for, because it's just too early at this point. And I'll just say that tabular uses a different, or analysis services tabular uses a different approach to real-time BI. Instead of proactive caching, it's going to use there's this other storage mode, which is not really a storage, but it's called direct query, where analysis services tabular just acts as a metadata layer on top of, say, your data warehouse, right? So you submit your queries, and it will only support DAX at this time, and you submit your queries, and it translates that down to SQL to your data source at runtime and gives you the data back, which means that in theory, you can deliver your metrics quicker because you don't need to wait for processing times. And there are other use cases for direct query as well, like if you've got such a big data set that won't fit into memory, you could use direct query for that as well. But I think it's early days for direct query. I think they're going to still do more work on direct query, and we'll see how that goes. Okay, so that's the history, and then the reason I went through this is because we can really evaluate, how major a release this is in terms of its features and its design goals, and it's comparable to going from 2000 to 2005, from multidimensional to tabular. That's where they've been putting the bulk of their work over the last 3 or 4 years is in tabular. Okay, we've got this new query language called DAX. Does anyone know what DAX stands for? I'm just kidding, it's right there. So there's this new query language called DAX, and you may ask, why do we even need another query language, right? Because we've already got MDX and Analysis Services, Analysis Services Tabular. I'm just going to keep calling it Tabular from now on, instead of Analysis Services. I'm just saying Tabular supports MDX, so why do we need DAX? Well, the reason is that, again, the feedback that Microsoft received was that MDX was out there in its own planet. So they primarily DAX is, it's trying to be more relational-like. You could also argue that it's more Excel-like because a lot of the functions have the same name and syntax as Excel functions. But I think primarily it's more relational-like. So, for example, instead of slicing by a member of a hierarchy, you're going to apply a filter condition that's more similar to a where clause condition. Right? But there are still some concepts in DAX that are pretty difficult to get to, even with a strong relational background. If you've got strong SQL skills but you've never done any DAX, you're not going to get some of these concepts instantly. Although Microsoft has tried. So, for example, filter context, right? The equivalent of filter context in MDX is the current dimensionality of a cell determined by the current member of all the attribute or of all the hierarchies in the cube, right? Kind of like the current coordinates of a cell. The filter context is the DAX equivalent of that, but instead of the current member of every hierarchy, it's like the current rows of every table that are in filter context, which is more relational-like, admittedly, but still it's quite a leap to get to instantly from having a SQL background. You need to write a few DAX queries to really get filter context. Okay, so a couple of things to bear in mind. When you're building calculations that are built into your cube or your tabular model, you'll notice that I'm saying cube or tabular model because a tabular model technically is not a cube. However, it looks like a cube, it feels like a cube. To the users, they're going to keep calling it a cube. I'm not going to go and, oh, excuse me, you shouldn't call that a cube. But technically it's not a cube. So we as BI professionals, we know what we're talking about. We shouldn't call it a cube, we should call it a tabular model. So if you're building calculations into your cube or tabular model, tabular, you have to use DAX, right? And by the way, the reason you would want to build calculations into your cube or tabular model is for reusability, primarily. So that all the queries that query your model can leverage those calculations. For multidimensional more so, you would also do it for caching purposes. So if you're doing it in tabular, you have to use DAX. In multidimensional, you have to use MDX. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. However, if you are querying your cube or your tabular model, tabular supports both DAX and MDX, right? And this is no coincidence. This is due to its shared lineage with multidimensional. This alone justifies Microsoft's decision to leverage its existing intellectual property that they had with multidimensional for tabular, because now all of the existing cube clients out there that generate MDX are going to migrate to tabular just fine, right? Excel, ProClarity, you know, reporting services, Panorama Nova View, if anyone knows that one. All of those existing Cube clients out there that generate MDX, they're going to migrate to Tabular very easily, and to the users, you know, generating a pivot table, it's going to look and feel quite similar to what they're used to. The learning curve for the users is going to be, you know, minimal. But for us, it's quite different. On the back end, it's quite different. However, if you're building a cube in multidimensional, that currently will only support MDX queries. It doesn't support DAX queries. Microsoft announced last year, you may be aware, they announced that this is going to change. They're going to add DAX support to multidimensional in a later release. And the reason for that is PowerView, because PowerView doesn't generate MDX, it generates DAX. So right now, PowerView will not work with multidimensional, and they've had feedback that they want to get it to work. You know, the users want to use that. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of multidimensional cubes out there that, you know, could benefit from a PowerView interface into that cube. So they're gonna add DAX support in the future. Okay. So as I said, we're covering more like the conceptual features and strengths and weaknesses of the release and the design goals, etc. In the next session, we're going to get pretty hardcore. Okay, so you don't want to miss that. We're going to get like really into some DAX and MDX and stuff like that. So come back for that. We don't have enough time to fit it all into one session. So I'd like to talk about this tool called BISM Normalizer. It's free. It's developed by the SQL community for the SQL community, which is why I'm allowed to talk about it here. You can get it from the Visual Studio Gallery, which is here. And funnily enough, by a huge coincidence, the guy who created it has the same name as me. Anyway, I could have even told you that I created it and you would have believed me. Anyway, okay, I created it, sorry. So what this is a database compare tool. It's the only database compare tool for tabular models. There's not much out there in the analysis services space in general, right? There are lots of, this is a mature area for relational databases, right? You've got tools like Schema Compare in Visual Studio, which you only get with Visual Studio Premium or Ultimate, which is an extra $4,000 in licensing cost. You've got Redgate, who are sponsors at this event. They've got a tool called SQL Compare. And the traditional sweet spot for relational database compare tools is for generating different scripts for deployment across dev, test, and production, right? So you're going to deploy a new version of your data warehouse to production. You can't just drop and recreate it, right? That might take weeks to reload all that data if it's even available. So what you do is you use one of these database compare tools to generate a different script that will just add column, you know, create tables as necessary to the model to bring it up to your new version, and you associate that script with the release. Okay. You can use BISM Normalizer for that, but it's about really what BISM Normalizer is about is a lot more than different scripting. But you can use it for that. So you know, you set your source and your target as the tabular model. It only works for tabular models. You set your source and target as a tabular model databases or projects, because it's a Visual Studio add-in, and it will, based off what you select, what differences you want to apply to the target, it will generate. You can use it to generate an XMLA script and associate it with the release. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're committing the terrible sin of deploying from Visual Studio to test or production, you know, which must be punished, and I would never do that. No, I'm just kidding. If you ever do that, you want to use BISM Normalizer, right? No, I'm just kidding. There's lots of perfectly qualified BI professionals that have had to resort to deploying from Visual Studio, but it's just not the best thing to do. If you ever find yourself doing that, use BISM Normalizer to generate the script. But that's not really what BISM Normalizer is about. There's a lot more to BISM Normalizer around the sharing common definitions and adhering to common business definitions and bridging the gap between self-service and corporate BI, which is what I'll talk about in a moment. So you may ask, I've been the one, describing all of these fluffy marketing terms like UDM and BISM, and then why did I call this thing the BISM normalizer? Right? I mean, I could have just called it like I don't know, analysis services, database compare, or something like that. But I chose BISM normalizer because I was kind of, let's say, I was influenced by Microsoft marketing hype. I was just kind of hypnotized. So I was going around, eat, sleeping, and drinking BISM, and then I decided to call it the BISM, and then instead of the BISM compare tool, no, that wasn't good enough. It had to be the BISM normalizer. Right? That's how I roll. Anyway, so when do we want to use this thing for? If it's you can use it for different scripting, but it's about a lot more than that. So let's talk about, this is a nice segue into self-service versus corporate BI. Okay, so to take a quote out of that book that I just gave you, if you start reading the section in that book on, which by the way, there's 2 sections in that book that recommend BISM normalizer, and as well as the other book that by Theo Lachev. There's like 2 separate chapters that have like separate paragraphs on BISM normalizer in that book. But to take a quote out of that book, a sure way to start an argument between 2 business intelligence professionals is to ask them their opinion of self-service BI. It's one of those contentious issues, like politics, right? Let's say you're courting your potential spouse, and you want to make sure everything's just right, and you want to introduce your parents to your potential parents-in-law. The last thing you want to do is start talking about politics, right? Because you may have to just call off the marriage right there. And there are other contentious issues as well, but in BI space currently the big one is self-service BI. So you've got the self-service BI camp, and then you've got the traditional corporate BI camp. So the corporate BI camp is a little bit more aloof, and they're like, oh well, goodness gracious, I would never dream of creating multiple versions of the same metric in different databases. I mean, how inefficient is that? What an atrocity. I mean, so they've got a point. I'm not going to kind of reveal which camp I'm a member of. That's irrelevant. Both camps have got strong arguments, right? So the corporate BI camp, their argument is that they claim to have solved the multiple versions of the truth issue, which is one of the key objectives of data warehouse, as a discipline, where we're coming from this situation where we've got just this epidemic of Excel hell in multiple in lots of enterprise organizations. I shouldn't call it Excel hell, it's spreadsheet hell, right? Spreadsheet hell. We don't care that it doesn't rhyme. So you've got spreadsheet hell, where you've got all of these reporting applications which are tightly coupled with the systems of record that generate queries directly to the systems of record, and they each do the same calculation over and over again, which means that it's very inefficient to manage. You've got multiple versions. These calculations are being performed subtly differently. The numbers are coming out differently. The terminology is inconsistent. It's just chaos. It's apples and oranges. It costs a lot of money from the enterprise standpoint to manage something like that, right? And data warehousing claims to have solved that. However, the counter-argument, there's 2 strong counter-arguments. One is that data warehousing actually, while it takes steps towards the single version of the truth, it's not the silver bullet, okay? Because I work I'm a consultant for a global oil company with business units throughout the world, and typically in large enterprise organizations, there's going to be a whole bunch of implementations out there, different data warehouse implementations in different countries and business units, and there's inevitably going to be some overlap in terms of the business definitions across each of these models and across each of these, the ETL that populates each of these models. So, there's still multiple versions of the truth, even in the corporate BI landscape. All right, and you saw that article earlier from David Campbell. In 5-10 years, there's going to be just a mass of tabular models out there, whether they be self-service or corporate, tabular models. There's going to be a whole bunch of them in a single enterprise. So how do you manage all that? How do you maintain consistency and adhere to common business definitions across all of these tabular models that are going to emerge over the next decade? Well, you can use BISM normalizer. For example, you could have. I'm kind of deviating onto the next bullet point. You could have maybe a common base model that different models inherit from, and you could push that common model to the kind of instances that extend that common model. There's reporting capabilities where you can report differences to ensure alignment with common business definitions and things like that. So you can use it for that. That's probably really what it's about. But the demo that I like to use is for self-service to corporate BI. So I'll quickly show you this. This is the only demo I'm going to have in this part. The next session is going to be pure demos, pure coding for all you techies that are just, getting all excited about writing some code and seeing some code. You're going to see that in the next session. So here I've got, let's say I built this model here in Power Pivot, right? I'm a business user, and I created this model in Power Pivot. I didn't want to lobby IT for 2 months to get it built into the data warehouse. I felt that this data was only relevant to my role anyway, so it didn't warrant being built into the data warehouse. Whether IT liked it or not, I was going to go ahead and do that. Sound familiar? So I built this model, and I've put it on SharePoint, and I've got a bunch of other users using it, and IT has now realized that this model is getting popular due to the SharePoint usage, and they want to bring it into the corporate BI model in analysis services. So how do we do that? So first thing you can do is you can take the Power Pivot model and you can bring it into analysis services by just saying File, New Project, Import from Power Pivot, and then you point it at the Excel file, and it will bring in the Power Pivot workbook, and it will look just like any other analysis services model. As I said before, this is the tabular model designer, which is shared with Power Pivot, right? The color scheme is different, but it's basically the same UI. So I brought this in from Power Pivot, but now what, right? Am I going to have a separate model for each Power Pivot migration? Like, where do I go from here, right? That doesn't help much. I need to take out the relevant parts of this model and merge it into the corporate model, right? So that's where BISM normalizer comes in. So let's say this is my Power Pivot migrated model, and I've got these. It just so happened that these two entities here with the measures, and BISM normalizer will work for all tabular model objects: tables, relationships, measures, KPIs, perspectives, roles, connections, everything. So I brought these two tables in. Sorry, I've migrated this whole model from Power Pivot, but I want to bring these two tables into the corporate model. So now I've got another analysis services tabular model over here, and this one doesn't have the currency tables. Okay, so I want to just import those into this model. So I can say compare tabular models. Again, my source and target can be either databases or projects. It's a Visual Studio add-in, so it will support running in, support tabular model projects as sources or targets. I'll go ahead and compare the differences, and it's going to list all the differences between the two models. Okay, and we should see that currency is not in the target, which is the corporate model. So these are the ones I want to push into the target, but inevitably when I'm taking some tables from a Power Pivot migrated model or something like that, I'm inevitably going to have and I want to put it in a corporate model, there's inevitably going to be a bunch of other tables I don't want to mess with, right, that are all in the corporate model. So there's going to be a bunch of these items like, do you want me to delete all of this? No, I don't want to delete anything that's already there. I don't want to mess with that. So these items that are missing in the source that it's asking me whether I want to delete, I'll just say in a couple of clicks, I'll say skip all objects missing in source, and those are all skipped now. I can just like schema compare in Visual Studio, you select each of these objects and you specify whether you want it to skip it or create it or update it or delete it. Exactly the same type of user experience design. And then down here I've got some other items which, for whatever reason, I don't want to bring these into the corporate model, so I just skip those. All right. So all I'm left with is these currency items. So I'll go ahead and validate selection, and it will tell me what it's going to do in this warning list It's going to tell me the objects that it's going to create in the target, and it would give me any warnings if there were name conflicts and things like that. So I'll go ahead and just commit the changes. Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. So this, before I click yes here, you see this little button up here, script changes. At the point where commit changes becomes enabled, I've got the option. I can either just commit it to the tabular project, to the databases, to the database, or I can generate an XMLA script with those changes and then go and associate that script with my release. And then I've got one script to deploy across environments, just like traditional relational database deployment, but for tabular models. Okay, so I've committed the changes to the target, and I now want to refresh the comparison just to make sure that it looks as I would expect. So what I'm expecting here is that the currency objects are in both the source and the target with the same definitions, which they are. And now if I open up the corporate model, which you saw earlier, didn't have those currency tables in. So they should be in there with all the relationships and measures and KPIs and stuff. Just takes a minute to open. It's basically schema compare for tabular models, you know. But as I say, the use cases may be a little bit different because tabular models are so business focused, you know, that they're really good representations of the true business model. So that's where there's an opportunity to align in terms of common business definitions, you know. So there you can see currency and currency rate. And then here are the new tables that are brought in. Okay? All right, excuse me. So, as I said, you can use it to migrate Power Pivot models to analysis services, to bridge the gap between self-service and corporate BI. You can use it in an enterprise environment for alignment with common business definitions, which helps address the multiple versions of the truth issue, given that we're, you know, at the infancy of this next wave of in-memory analytics. How do we manage all of these tabular models that are going to emerge? And then there's a bunch of other use cases you could use it for. For example, if you know, in the .NET world, quite often you might branch your code base for parallel development, right? And you know, your C# files and everything, so that you for whatever business requirements you need to branch the code base. Anyone who's ever done that, anyone who's, you know, a build and deployment type engineer, they know that merging those changes back into the main trunk can be a complete nightmare. And that's for C# files where there are tools that will try and merge it for you. With tabular models, obviously you can't try and merge the XMLA, just forget it, it's going to be a real challenge. So you can use it for merging different branches back into the main trunk, or even in cases where, you know, if you notice, the tabular model projects have just got one file with one database for the whole project. It's not like a C# project or even a multidimensional project where you've got a bunch of different files, which means that if one developer checks this out to do some work, no one else can do any work. If you've got a team with multiple developers, you know, you can't, one developer checks it out and that's it, no one else can do any work. So, or the alternative is you can have parallel development on different versions of the BIM file, and then when you're done, merge it back together. There's a bunch of use cases out there. You just got to be, you know, creative about it. Okay. So, where are we? So, I could jump into the next part, or I can answer any questions. As I say, the next bit is going to be more in-depth demos with MDX and DAX and comparing a lot of the features between multidimensional and tabular, and you know, how do we achieve the same end result using the two different sub-products. So if you're interested in that, come back at 11. In the meantime, I've still got 10 minutes left. You know, if you like, what I can do, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to ask, is there a reason you would get tabular over multi-dimensional or vice versa?
Okay, good question. That's the question that a lot of people are asking right now, right? I'd say if you've got an existing multidimensional cube, say in 2000, 2008, and it's working just fine, right? You don't have any major performance issues or anything like that, then I would say don't bother migrating it to tabular just because it's a cool technology, right? If, however, you're having major performance issues, it might address those. So you might want to do a proof of concept to confirm whether it would really address those. But then, on the other hand, if you're starting out and you're doing a brand new project, right, and there are some features which are not supported in tabular, which we're going to cover at the end of the next session. I've got a slide. In fact, you know, we've got 10 minutes. I can cover the slide if you like now, which is the features that are not supported in tabular. So if you need some of those, you would probably want to stick with multidimensional. But those are so kind of few and far between, so rare that you know, and probably the old 80-20 rule. You know, 80% of the projects having good performance is much more important than having write back or some of the other features that, you know, I may as well just run through the slide now. I mean, we've got enough time if I can find it. Right. Yeah, exactly. So there's so many multidimensional cubes out there that it's not going to migrate to tabular overnight, right? And if Microsoft had said, sorry, we're not supporting multidimensional anymore, I mean, that would have been pandemonium, right? There would have been a rebellion. So, you know, I'd say if you've got an existing project that's working fine with multidimensional, don't bother upgrading it to tabular. If, however, you're having major performance issues or you're starting out brand new and you don't need any of these features, which looks like a lot more than what it is on the slide, then I would say, you know, in terms of the longevity of the product, you know, in terms of this is the strategic direction that BI in general is going, I would say that then definitely look at tabular, which is likely to get enhanced more in the future as well, right? I mean, okay, let's discuss these. We've got enough time. There are some important things there. Good point. All right, so display folders. The tabular model editor doesn't support display folders. However, you can use AMO, Analysis Management Objects, to set display folders. You just need to write a bit of code and integrate that into your build and release process. There's a blog post on my blog that has that code that you can use if you want to use display folders. So a lot of these, there are workarounds, right? Just like display folders. Name sets defined in the model. You know, in multidimensional, you can define your name sets in the MDX script. Obviously, you can't do that in tabular, but you can do it client-side using MDX, and you could even potentially store a metadata layer just like ProClarity used to and have some metadata definitions in there. You know, again, some of these are just inconveniences rather than showstoppers, right? Non-aggregatable hierarchy, you can't get rid of the all member, or at least the tabular model designer doesn't support that. I haven't tried setting it using AMO. So that means, for example, in the demo you're going to see in the next session, we're going to do currency conversion. So you've got a hierarchy with all of the different currencies. It doesn't make sense to sum up US dollars with British pounds with Brazilian reais, right? Which is normally, the all member is the default member, which is normally the sum of all the children. So ideally you'd like to not have an all member in some scenarios. You can't do that using the tabular model editor. So you're stuck with the all member, but again, it's not a showstopper. You know, you can just show your base currency, maybe US dollars for the all member. It's not the end of the world, right? You know, it's for when the users drag the hierarchy onto the pivot table, the all member would have to show US dollars or something in that particular scenario. There's often a workaround, right? Non-standard default members for hierarchies. In that situation, you're going to get rid of the all member, which is the default member normally. So then you're going to have to specify another default member. Well, you can't get rid of the all member, and you can't specify the default member. So again, it's not a huge deal. Ignore related dimensions. You're going to see this in the demo, right? So multidimensional has this feature, ignore related dimensions, where if you have a measure group that's not related to a dimension, and the users are, of course, going to try and view the numbers by the, I want to view, I don't know, something that just doesn't make any sense at all. They're obviously going to try it, but it's just going to ignore the unrelated dimensions, just repeat the value for every single member. Or what's more intuitive is you can set ignore unrelated dimensions to false, and then it shows nulls. Again, the tabular model designer doesn't support that. Is that the end of the world? Probably not. Custom drill through. You have drill through in tabular, but it will only show you the columns of the kind of fact table in question. You can't define custom columns. But Bids Helper, which is another great tool out there that you should install in your development environments, which currently is more focused on multidimensional. It's got a whole history of features for multidimensional. Bids Helper. And it's starting to bring in a bunch of new features for tabular, including custom drill through. So you can do this one in tabular, you just need Bids Helper. All right. MDX stored procedures, just like, I did a presentation in PASS in 2005 on SQL CLR, right? I claim to be I claim to know a lot about SQL CLR. I have to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think I've used it once in a real project, right? It's kind of like, there are some very specialized scenarios, and there's this MDX store procedure project on Codeplex that you can have a look at, and it's got some administrative functions and things like that. But realistically, it's not the type of thing you're going to be building in most projects, MDX store procedures, and you can't in tabular. All right, so again, not the end of the world. And then cell and column level security, it's not quite as granular as multidimensional, because you can set up a role in tabular and then you supply a DAX filter that is kind of row based, whereas in multidimensional you can get a bit more granular. Again, probably not the end of the world. But these ones are very, very specialized, right? Like writeback for kind of budgeting type applications where you want to change the value of a member in the cube and see it allocated across the hierarchy. This type of thing, if you've got an existing project that uses writeback and really needs it, then there is no option in tabular. There's no workaround for this, right? So they're very specialized. So there are some cases where it just doesn't support it, and writeback is one of them. So I'm starting to get to the ones now that there is no workaround, right? So writeback, translations, I'm sure that will come in a future release. Again, if you're out there in Europe and you're supporting, countries throughout the European zone, and you've got all these different currencies and languages and stuff, that may be a showstopper for you. But most projects, that's not an issue. Unary operators for kind of chart of accounts. You want custom roll up across different members. You can use unary operators. Aren't available in tabular. There's a workaround in that book. Again, very, very specialized features. And then we already covered this big one, which is MDX script set assignments and utility dimensions. There may be some really niche, really advanced, customized calculation scenarios that you might need MDX script cell assignments for. But when we first saw tabular and tabular first came out, a lot of us who have been using multidimensional for many years were like, well, how on earth are you going to support all of these requirements that we see in multidimensional with MDX scripting? I have to admit, the more I've used tabular, the more I have to admit that it does cover the vast majority of cases, and the more I have to admit that multidimensional was actually more complicated than it really needed to be, right? So again, there are some niche cases, but overall, if you're starting out a brand new project, if you don't need any of this, and especially if you want to have good, better performance out of the box, right? The other question is cost of ownership, because X velocity is the default way of storing the data. You don't even need to. There's a couple of memory settings here and there, but by and large, you don't need to even optimize this thing. It's just going to give you blazing fast performance out of the box. You don't need to design aggregations. You don't need to use Profiler to check whether your aggregations are being hit. You don't need to do a bunch of the extra work that you have to in multidimensional to get it to perform nicely, right? It just performs out of the box. The cost of ownership is much less with tabular. So that's another factor. And as I said, we're really at the dawn of this new age, right? So you probably want to take all of that into account. Again, you may need some of these. They may be showstoppers, but if they're not, and you're starting out on a brand new project, especially if you haven't got a lot of multidimensional existing skills, you're going to probably pick up tabular more easily. Okay, Yep.
Given that we've got a really full room, I just want to take
Yep.
that place. Is there anybody, just see a raise of hands, anybody who can't stay for part two? Is everybody staying? Everybody can meet the seat. Take a look at who just raised their hands, because those seats are going to be open. And if you're leaving, could you please give me your evaluation sheet? If you're staying, put your evaluation sheet, just fill it out for both parts.
Okay.
Even if you haven't filled it out, give me the blank one.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to seeing you in the next session if you're staying. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
So this Excel assignment is scopes.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
The question are, I have a powerful box and I can play with it.
You have powerful what?
Powerful box. I have
Okay. Yeah.
full
Yeah.
terabyte of RAM. I can sit in I/O.
Yeah.
I have a UDM model I created for the company and I use it.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. So I want to try it out. I mean, to put it to tabular. Is there
Yeah.
any automated way, sort of automated way to put it to tabular?
From multidimensional? No, not really.
Oh.
Yeah. There were a couple of tools out there that claim to have a go at this, but really, you know, a lot of the stuff you have to do differently. Like there's so much that's built into the metadata of the model in multidimensional that you can't build into the metadata of the model in tabular. If you're staying for the next session, you'll see, you know, that a lot of the responsibility is offloaded to DAX, and it makes it quite difficult to try and automatically migrate a different paradigm, right? So yeah, if you want to do a prototype in Power Pivot, migrate that to analysis services, absolutely, that's all good. But from multidimensional, there's nothing I would really recommend. Okay, all right.
And the extra procedure is, for example, for our company to show cover. In this
Okay,
case,
all right.
because the trick is we have a UDM and they slice and dice it, and then they want to, what's a drill down? But the whole drill down doesn't work for them. I've used MDX store procedure.
There was I think it was Moshe Pazmansky had a blog post about using an MDX store procedure as part of maybe we got it off the same one, right? Where he was using an MDX store procedure as part of a custom drill through. And yeah, there are some niche cases where you may actually need that. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So thank you for that. Okay, you're welcome.